Hey, welcome to Boundary Break, a show where we basically take the camera anywhere we want to try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games. And you're watching a second part to an Elden Ring video series where we're going to try to find all sorts of interesting trivia by taking the camera out of its intended boundaries. Now, first I want to thank Franz Bouma for the initial camera. And for this part, we got rid of fog and the transparency effect that happens when you go through models. So I want to thank Lance McDonald and Zully the Witch for taking care of the transparency effect, and Baseline X for the mod that removes the fog. And also, I'll be taking a look at all the things that you guys suggested to me in the last video, which, by the way, make sure to leave me comments for what you want to see in the next video. Anyways, longer intro, so why don't we just snap into the next scene. So quick disclaimer, I am covering this series as I go through the game, so I'm not spoiling myself to get certain information. However, I do understand that the beast clergyman does have his own boss fight later in the game that I have not seen yet, but I do know what that boss form looks like in its second phase, and I do know that for this first phase, there's a lot of details than the one that you might see if you play the game later, but this armor looks a little bit different from the second phase form, and more important than that, if we take the camera underneath that armor, you can see that there are eye sockets and a dog-like snout that you wouldn't be able to see either way. And in fact, this whole segment's going to be dedicated to some creatures that we can now look up close, once again, thanks to the ability to look at enemy models without them fading away. And everybody, no matter how far you are into the game, will know about the grafted scion. Now that he isn't moving around sporadically, we can take the camera over to show you the human form of this grotesque monster up close, revealing some regal shirts and headpieces to his completely human-like face, as well as where his human form starts to blend in with his mutated husk. And of course, in Mogwin's second boss room, if we take a look inside the cocoon, you can see that there's an entire model inside, despite the fact that the player normally only gets to see the arm. And then this is really cool. So there's these enemies that attach themselves to you and can take off a huge chunk of health. You can see their mouths through their little potato sacks. But in order to save time on resources or just simply use the beard on this character model, it shares the same model as the Albernaic people, revealing that there's a head inside of the head. And it's not as simple as just having that head in a knapsack, as you can see that his mouth is a completely separate mouth from the mouth that the player gets to see. And I was pretty excited about this one. Here we got butterflies. And taking the camera close up to the butterflies will show you that the body of the butterfly is fully modeled, but instead of having bug-like features on the top, it seems to have a rounded surface with a little slit down the middle. And let's take a look at some more characters from the round table hold. Now, if you want a more comprehensive look at all the characters without any helmets on whatsoever, there is a video that Zully the Witch put out. I recommend you check that out, but the focus of my show is always just what you can see by moving the camera. And because these characters have certain types of armor on, the features of their faces change with it. But a character like the Dung Eater has his face fully modeled inside the helmet, showing a really wide nose and a scar on his right eye, as well as a goatee on his chin. And then, much to my surprise, the marionette creatures that you can find as early as the Lucaria Academy has facial features underneath its helmet. Now, it doesn't have eyes per se, but it has eye sockets, which was not something I was expecting to see, because the helmet does nothing to expose any of these details to the player. In fact, with a nose hole like that, it kind of has the features of a skull more than anything else. And then there's some humanoid enemies that I never expected to be at all interesting, but taking the camera up to an enemy like this can show you that they have really creepy eyes, as all you can see is mostly black with a hint of yellow. And then again, there's some bosses where you just don't really get a good look at their faces. So this one in particular has a similar thing going on where his eyes are mostly black with just a tinge of yellow in them, but he also features some scars as well as a big bushy beard. And of course, then there's this area after you defeat the fire giant with really impressive tornado effects. What we're going to look at here is all the flying beasts that are off in the distance. And it's really shocking to see the level of detail that is on each and every single one of these things, despite the fact that there's so many of them flying at any given time. As it turns out, they're all dragons, and although they are textureless, the geometry and lighting effects makes for a really impressive detail that's far away. And then I wanted to talk about something that we tried to talk about in the first episode, which, by the way, is still worth checking out after this one, as we're not going to revisit everything. But this is one enemy in particular that a lot of people are asking about, and due to the fact that the enemy was disappearing as you got closer and closer, you just kind of had to take my word for it, essentially, about what happens to your character once it gets grabbed by this particular enemy. And now I can show you what it looks like inside with all the snakes hanging from a couple of wooden pegs, and I can show you the exact frame in which your character is no longer invisible and is revealed once again to you, the player. And what's really fascinating here is that it doesn't seem to be your normal culling effect, but instead the game is programmed to deliberately turn your character invisible. And as you're already seeing that it's frozen on a frame where you can start to see the character model come back into full visibility. And one more enemy that I wanted to circle back to were these sorcerers that have these goofy Burger King helmets. Well, in the original episode, I showed you evidence that there's crystals in the base of the neck. For whatever reason, they're supposed to be protruding from the bottom of the helmet and not necessarily from the top of the neck. The modeling seems to be more specifically designed for whatever you're going to see below the neck. Anyways, with that said, let's do a zoom out of one of the many areas of the game now that we don't have any fog ruining the beautiful, beautiful shot. Alright, now let's start talking about some stuff that we can find out of bounds. And once again, after just beating the fire giant myself, I had to take a look in the PC version to see what exactly is happening during the fight. And one of the coolest things I found was that during the first phase of the fire giant, if you take the camera underneath the ground, you can see the second phase of the fire giant resting on a rock, waiting to be called into the game. Meaning that any given time during the first phase of this boss fight, there's two versions of the fire giant. And then once again, because I did a part 1 video first, a lot of great suggestions came from the YouTube comments, and one of the most common ones I saw was wanting to know what happens to Radon when he flies up into the sky and does like a meteor attack back down onto the ground. And sad to say, looking top and bottom, underneath, and over, you cannot find the Radon model anywhere in the map. It's likely turned invisible, similar to what we saw earlier. But I can show you the exact frame in which he disappears and the exact frame and position where he ends up as he starts barreling back down towards the player. And then there's this tower that you can turn upside down with a key item. And I was really surprised how elaborate this whole thing gets in order to accomplish this effect. I'm going to do my best to illustrate what's going on visually, but ultimately, you're not going to make heads or tails about what exactly you're looking at without a good explanation. So what I can tell here is that it truly is positioned correctly, with the door frame from the inside of the building and the bridge that you eventually get to lining up perfectly. However, that's not how you get to the door in the actual game, as it's pretty much out of reach to the player. So like what I said earlier, you turn the whole thing upside down, but you don't actually turn it all upside down. In truth, there's a duplicated version of this entire tower stored underneath the original tower, and you can see remnants of that here with enemy corpses remaining where the environment should be. And then when you quote-unquote flip it upside down, the upside down version loads in, and the player starts scaling his way down to a dummied up upside down version of that same door that you need to get onto the bridge. So here's where the visual trickery comes to a complete head. Like I said, everything is underground, so how do you end up at the top of the bridge? Well, let's start off by telling you that this is what it looks like truthfully outside this door frame, and that when you start opening the doors, a cutscene is triggered, and the original position of the player is no longer where it was when you started opening the door. Instead, it's all the way up here, where that bridge originally was, and a small little mock-up of the tower top to boot. The other heavily requested thing was that there is a giant cloud on the map that's in the dead center in between all the towers, where you get the great runes. In some social media posts, they even made a point to say that there's a giant empty square where there should be land underneath the water layer, and that's really interesting. However, you can find empty squares in various spots on the map. Like there's one underneath this tower, which may indicate that there's going to be a final tower in a DLC update, but in a less favorable spot, there's also another square over to the left of a tower over in this corner. I did bring my character over there just to see if anything would load in. Maybe there's some invisible geometry and, you know, you let go of the no clip code and it just loads everything in, but sadly that's not the case. Whatever is supposed to be there does not exist at this point in time. Also, here's where Patch's model spawns in. Before you grab the chest, his model is not there, but the second you open the chest, the game does load in his model over in this corner. So you're seeing the first frame in which he does load into the map. And here you go, here's another awesome zoom out of a different part of the map. Alright, now let's talk about several things regarding the environment. To start with, let's talk about Lindell. And the reason why I want to talk about Lindell is because it's the example I'm going to be using here for part 2 for what a low poly model version of the same exact city looks like versus the highest quality version. So we've taken the camera over here all the way from a very far distance, and you can see how all the models' qualities are significantly reduced. There's no example better than that, than the dragon that's in the center of the city. Now I'm going to go ahead and transition the scene into what it's supposed to look like when you're actually playing inside the city. And there's this one little oddity that I just wanted to take a look at. It's very disappointing what the reality is, but on the map here, you can see some sort of recessed land inside the ocean itself. In normal circumstances, there's just a whole lot of fog that covers up this area, but with the fog removed, we can now see what's truly off in the distance, and it's frankly nothing at all, outside of a couple of loose pieces of geometry, which by the way are nowhere near the position on this map. In fact, I can have my character stand right on top of this map spot, and when we look in relation to that, you're just going to see that the character is just standing above ocean water. Again, something that may come in the future, but what's more odd than anything else is that off in the distance, you can occasionally find land masses that are fairly uniquely shaped. And to give you an idea of the scale of this land, I brought my character all the way out here just to show you. And as you can see, the land mass is huge, like absolutely enormous. And it's also really, really far outside the map. Like one of the best things about no clipping in Elden Ring is that it'll still track your character's position even if you go really far outside the image that the developers made for the map itself. So you can see where I am in relation to the main map in order to stand on this landmass. It's really far out. But sadly, once again, in an attempt to maybe load it or just see if it has any solid ground, you'll see here, I just died. You're not going to be able to load a higher poly model of this area because it was always fully intended to just be backdrop scenery. And depending where you are, like for example here with the Haligtree, you may load in an entirely different piece of landmass. Once again, here I am on the map, and here's the landmass that is formed in this area. This one's a little more detailed than the one that I just showed you earlier, featuring textures and a higher polygon count. And that's it for now. I'm just going to show you some really cool footage that I collected that doesn't really have anything important to say other than just it's fun to look at. And I hope you hit subscribe, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this video enough to want to see a part 3. Just let me know if you do. And of course, let me know what you want to see if you have any ideas. Just keep in mind that there is a part 1, so if you haven't seen that yet, I recommend you check that one out first before leaving any suggestions. Take it easy, everybody.